Hi folks, and welcome to another edition of Government Matters. This is a special edition of the show because we have, number one, 3 guests here. And number 2, we're going to be talking about a topic that some people might say, well, we know all this, but I guarantee you by the end of this program, you're not going to be able to say that. And that is how we got to this point. We're sitting here in the Focus Springfield studios, and right through that wall over there is MGM. We're on the MGM property. So what we're going to talk about is how we got here and sort of the twisted kind of path that led us to having a nearly $1 billion casino investment in the city of Springfield, and for that matter, in the region. So my guests today know all the dirt, and we're going to try to get them to tell us the dirt as much as we can. Sitting right over here is Anthony Cignoli. You'll know that Tony is a political consultant known literally around the world, who is a Springfield guy. His offices are still here in Springfield, but Tony was intimately involved with many different aspects of this casino story. Sitting next to him is Joe Wagner, state representative from Chicopee, who's the chairman of the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies. Joe played a very critical role in crafting the legislation that allowed casinos to be considered here in Massachusetts. And finally, but certainly not least, is Michael Fenton, Springfield City Councilor, who served as City Council President during a lot of the key moments in crafting the host community agreement and getting the approvals necessary for MGM to move forward. Thank you very much, guys, for coming in this morning to talk about this.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to do this in roughly chronological terms, and because if people think that this was all about since, what, 2011 when the casino gaming legislation was signed by the governor, it had roots previous to that. And I'm going to talk to Tony a little bit about those previous roots. If you remember the 1996 mayoral race between Charles Ryan and Michael Albano, you might also remember that casinos was being brought up as an integral part of that race with a referendum question for the city of Springfield. And that referendum question was whether or not we should have casinos, and this is 1996. And at that time, Charlie Ryan was against casinos as part of his mayoral campaign and platform. Mike Albano was for it. It turned out Albano won the mayorship, but the referendum question supporting casinos in Springfield at that time failed. And Tony, I know that you were involved in that, so how did we even get to the point of a referendum question in 1996, years and years before the Commonwealth actually considered all this?
You know, literally, it was an idea of Peter Pignelli, who had thought about something that would be economic engine for this region that would be different. And certainly his thoughts about a casino were very similar to what MGM eventually did here, to try to make something that was transformational to certain neighborhoods, to certain areas. And the biggest piece, to create jobs. So Peter had this idea. And long story short, I remember my car had broken down. I didn't have the dough to get it out of neutral Ford back in the day. I'm getting off the bus downtown. Peter pulls up in his Rolls Royce. Hey, Tone, I got to talk to you. And we had a conversation. The next thing I knew, we were out talking to folks about partnerships. And Peter really vetted a lot of different players on this because this was a big deal to him. It was home. It had to be done right. And so we had gone to New York to see Donald Trump and his organization, met with a fellow named Skip Bronson there, talked to the folks from President Riverboat Casinos, kicked around with Harrah's, a little bit with Hilton early on, and wound up with a fellow named Arthur Goldberg. Bally's, the name that you see on everything from pinball machines to the rest of their entertainment empire. They were very large at that time. We partnered, and we talked about a casino on Peter's bus property that would also include the old Charles Hotel and going into Union Station. So even now, all this time later, a lot of the development in Springfield, perhaps maybe some of the conversation initially about casino may have opened up some of those thoughts about how and where some of these things would happen. But it was an amazing run. And actually, that particular election actually was the municipal cycle. It was 95, actually. So Ryan versus Albano. And the other part of this that was still amazing to me, that I still look back to in my own career, is that we got the go for that election from Governor Weld on August 31st, 95. And it was basically, go ahead, you've got your referendum. We had collected well over 10,000 signatures from folks, submitted them to the Commonwealth. And, you know, literally, it was a Saturday. I remember getting the call from the governor, running upstairs at Monarch Place to see Peter Pignelli in his office. You're not going to believe it. But the catch was this. I thought that the governor was talking about 2 years down the road, the next November, two November cycles away. And that wasn't the case. And he laughed about it, and he says, no, you've got till this November. So from August 31st to November 8th of that year, that was the amount of time we had. We were down 31 points when we started on August. It's impossible from the 31st of August to November 8th to make up that much ground. But we lost by half a point. So that's how far and how fast we were able to present the idea to the people of Springfield. There was an appetite at that time. And if not to go too long, what was missing though, what we didn't have, was there wasn't a structure in place. The electorate in Springfield and the legislature weren't satisfied with how this would go about because there was no Joe Wagner to have done all the hard work to figure this out, the checks, the balances, how to regulate. So greatly to Joe's credit, that's what was missing back then. You know, he was not at the helm of getting this hard job done. And that was where we couldn't convince the people of Springfield that this is safe, this is going to be good, and here's how it's going to be good for everyone in the region. What changed was Joe's legislation.
If it had passed, what would have happened? Obviously, the state would have had to craft legislation to regulate all this.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there too. I think Speaker Finneran was
I don't think
there.
it was binding on.
Yeah,
right.
It wasn't binding.
Right.
That was the problem.
So it was to gauge public sentiment.
Right.
And I remember there was a conventional thought at that time because the two mayoral candidates were in complete opposite corners on it. One was strongly in support, the other was strongly in opposition, and the campaign centered as much around that issue as any other issue that voters would consider in making their choice of who they wanted to serve as mayor. And the conventional thought was a vote for casinos is a vote for Mike Albano, a vote in opposition to the casinos is a vote for Charlie Ryan. I was looking at it from Chicopee saying I disagree with that. If either of the candidates makes the case, Charlie Ryan, for example, yeah, I'm opposed to casinos, but here's my economic development agenda in the alternative. And if Michael Albano, on the other hand, had said, I'm for casinos, but it's only a part of my economic development agenda. I said, the question could go one way, and the election could go the other way, which is in fact what happened.
Yeah, well said, very well said. Yeah.
So after the 95 elections, then is it fair to say that the issue of casino gaming sort of laid dormant for a while then?
Yeah, you know, it was talked about. Tony made appropriate reference to Peter Pignelli. He really championed it. I remember a meeting that I think may have been had locally with Steve Wynn.
Yes.
And you know, so it was something Peter was supportive of. And yeah, at the end of the day, in order to craft legislation, there's got to be a political will to try and move it forward, and that didn't happen until about a decade later, or after that 1995 mayoral race and non-binding ballot question. So it really took on life, and I don't want to fast forward too far, but Governor Deval Patrick, who was elected in 2006, almost immediately undertook a study to determine whether the idea of brick and mortar casinos in the Commonwealth made good economic sense. And so there was certainly dollars associated with it that could be used to fund state programs, including local aid. To give you an example of one prominent thing that could be done with those new revenues. But he wanted to make sure that as a matter of public policy, it made sense beyond just the dollars. And he concluded that it did based on the study. And so back in 2007, he forwarded to the legislature a piece of gaming legislation. Now, interesting about that, when he unveiled it, he suggested, as I recall, and I'm doing this from memory, 3 regions. There would be, you know, an east, a west, and a southeastern region. Right. But when he filed the legislation, it had changed. The western region was no longer the 4 western counties, but it in fact included Worcester. And I think that was a nod to Tim Murray, who was from Worcester, and at that time the lieutenant governor. Worcester didn't want to compete with the Boston market for a casino. So my reaction to that was, it doesn't help us here in Western Massachusetts. I can talk more about it later, but the speaker at the time, Sal DeMacy, was not interested in moving forward policy around the issue of expanded gaming, and for any number of reasons. But so it died, although there were some interesting moments before that happened, because the committee that considered the bill that the governor had filed was pretty much deadlocked. And while the speaker didn't want the bill to go to the floor, it was such that it might have gone to the floor, his thoughts notwithstanding. But it didn't, and so it was delayed then until 2009, when Bob DeLeo became the speaker. His view of the issue was very different than his predecessors had been, and that's part of the history. So. That's the long answer to your question. Did it go dormant?
No. I want to hear the long answers to the question.
Well, and Peter, who was, Peter and I were very close, and I certainly knew his feelings about it. He passed in, I believe, November of 2004. I remember the last conversation I had with him. It wasn't about this issue. It was actually about securing monies for the Spirit of Springfield, and wow. that he was involved in.
Right.
And he made an ask, and then so that last time I had, and it was on election day, because I was at a polling place, and Peter called, and I asked him how he was doing, and he said, "I need your help." He was in some position. He was chairing a committee for Judy Matt at Spirit of Springfield, and I don't recall what the issue. I think it was Bright Nights.
I think it was for Bright Nights. Yeah.
Wow. But I think, he was such a presence that in his absence, he was a big part of the discussion over a long period of time. So, and again, it was prominent in 1996, in part because Mike Albano made it so prominent a part of his campaign.
Mm. And the interesting
95.
thing is that his son, of course, was very much involved with casino development, with this whole cycle that culminated with MGM. So it almost stayed like a part of the family business, or part of the family concerns then. So I was going through some of the stories that I've written over the years, and I got one from 2010, and it talks about that Governor Patrick and Senate President Murray and Speaker DeLeo were meeting to try to deal in 2010 with a legislative logjam. And in fact, in this particular piece, I quote Joe Laschinger, who was Vice President and General Counsel for Penn National, saying that he thought that Massachusetts had only one more year of a, quote, window of opportunity before casino developments in nearby states would weaken the Massachusetts market. So this was before the successful conclusion of the legislative process, obviously. And I'm sure that you were in the middle of this logjam trying to unjam it. What were some of the concerns that were happening in the legislature that were holding up the legislature?
So 2010 was the second year of a two-year session, and the House had moved forward. I was chairing the Transportation Committee at that time. Brian Dempsey, who would later chair the Ways and Means Committee, was chairing the Economic Development Committee, and had fashioned the legislation that the House had voted on. And in the measure that we passed in the 2009-2010 session, the House bill allowed for 2 casinos, but without regard for geography, and if it's so, and that we would let the market determine, so that if they were side by side in Boston, so be it. If they were side by side in Springfield, so be it. If they were side by side in Worcester, so be it. If it happened to be Boston and Central Mass, that would have been, that was the approach the House took. The Senate, in crafting their version of the bill, did the 3 regions, A, B, and C, a Western region, Eastern region, and Southeastern region. The bill that ultimately came to us through a conference committee and went to the governor, then Governor Patrick, was one that provided for 3 regions as the Senate had wanted, but the House bill had 2 slot facilities, separate of the potential for 3 brick and mortar facilities. Mm-hmm. And the legislation required that those slots facilities be tied to racing. and the governor viewed that that was basically a nod to two existing tracks that they would get slots facilities. And I would have argued that while it may have made some sense, I always liked the idea of tying slots and racing together. I think they go together, and I think the experience we've had under the law at Plain Ridge, down in the Foxborough area, has been a very positive experience. And we've seen lottery revenue shoot way up. The legislation requires that lottery products be sold at all of the casinos. But so the governor was not happy with the slots being tied to racing, and he thought it was basically, you know, it was a non-competitive type of thing. You could argue that if somebody wanted to build a track and start racing, that they could then apply for a license, but you know, the governor thought it lined up for the two existing tracks, and he cried foul, and he vetoed the bill on the last day of the session, and the legislature didn't, formal sessions in the legislature, we didn't have an opportunity to take it up for override. And in the next session, 2011, 2012, I went to Economic Development as Brian Dempsey went to Ways and Means. We came back around on it. The two questions the speaker had for me are, how do you feel about slots and racing? I said, well, they should certainly go together, but obviously we're going to have to look at it differently than we did in the last session so that we don't run up against this again. And my other piece of advice was, let's get this done in the first year of a two-year session. To Joe Lassinger's remarks, I wouldn't agree right down the line, but we certainly have seen some advancement by other states to promote gaming, some expanding offerings and some beginning with offerings. So he was right on that part of it, but it didn't really prevent us from getting where we were trying to get to. And we did do it in the first year of that two-year session. And in 2011, November of 2011, the governor signed the casino legislation.
Now, Mike, maybe you can confirm an old man's memory here. I remember that initially Mayor Sarno talked about how he preferred the casino in the woods format. I don't know if you remember him making those statements. He made them several times to the press. I know there was a point where someone was suggesting putting slot machines at the Mass Mutual Center, and he didn't like that either. We had a complete sea change in Springfield, though. We went from talking about that type of issue, not in our community, to suddenly having Ameristar, Hard Rock, MGM, and Penn Gaming all competing to get into the city of Springfield. What was your first involvement as a member of the city council with this issue?
Well, first, it's really interesting to hear the perspectives of Representative Wagner and Mr. Cignoli, because just the institutional knowledge and the history that you guys possess and the background information is really beneficial to me to hear personally. Springfield's been on the back end of this. We've been the beneficiaries of some of the hard work that was done by Mr. Picknelly Sr. and really two of the gentlemen that are in this room. When did I first get involved? It was about a year to a year and a half after first getting elected. So I would say somewhere in 2011, 2012, that was the first time that I was approached and had a discussion with people in the community about the real possibility of gaming being legalized. For most who weren't such a part of that process, I think for the decades before, casino was always a discussion, it was always on the table, but most of the electorate, I feel, became a little disenchanted with the concept and feeling that it would never really get done. There were so many referendums and so many attempts and so many different communities. We talked about Springfield's unsuccessful referendums, but Holyoke had a few successful referendums in the mid-90s, and that nevertheless didn't result in a coalescing of legislative support until we got to the legislative sessions that Mr. Wagner's talking about. So when I first was engaged in those discussions, it was sort of a surreal concept. I had to wrap my mind around whether or not this was really going to happen and envision what types of conversations that would necessitate across the city. So, you know, you referenced some of the mayor's earlier remarks. I don't remember him saying that specifically, to be honest with you, about the casino in the woods. But I know that that was the that was the consensus originally. That's the experience that we have in the Northeast about what a successful casino looks like.
Right.
You know, those were the examples that we have in Southern Connecticut. And so that's sort of how many people came into this process viewing what a successful casino looks like. As we got further into that and we dug a little bit deeper, we learned from some of the proposals that were brought forward earlier. You talked about is it the Charles Hotel?
Yeah.
And Union Station and Mr. Pignelli's transportation station across the street, which will soon be a Wayfinders. And we saw that there were other ways to look at it. So at that time, in 2011, 2012, there were a lot of casino companies that were interested, not just in Springfield, not just Ameristar, Penn, and MGM, but also Hard Rock and Holyoke, and later in West Springfield, and many, many more.
I think, you know, when you start reviewing the number of companies that were involved and where they were involved, MGM originally wanted Brimfield with the idea, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that they would petition the state to get a separate exit on the Mass Pike so they could have their casino in the woods in Brimfield, but it would have access to a major interstate. And of course, that didn't work out when they found out that they couldn't get their separate entrance. And
well, if I may, I think all of those companies were surveying the landscape literally across the Commonwealth. What market makes sense for us? What are the impediments to our considering this location versus other locations? Or what are the benefits and advantages? So I can tell you that I know MGM was in the Berkshires. They were here. They were in Central Mass. They were everywhere. And so were all of the other companies. Because it's there were limited opportunities, up to 3, and the legislation didn't require the issuance of 3 licenses and 1 slots facility. The second go-around, we did a single slots facility. We did not tie it to racing, and what do you know, it just so happens that the racing venue prevailed because it made sense to partner those 2 things together. And so the Gaming Commission made that determination. But MGM looked everywhere. And I'll say this to the councilor's remarks. You know, the mayor, my mayor in Chicopee way back when, Joe Chessie, was on the Board of Aldermen before he was mayor, and he voted against the acquisition of surplus property at Westover Air Reserve Base for industrial and or residential development. And he was the only member of the Board of Aldermen to vote against it. Then he was elected mayor, and the council had taken a vote in support of it. So he had to see that through. In the case of Mayor Sarno, you know, for whatever he may have thought when it was conceptual, when it was, you know, when it was an idea rather than when it was reality, now that it's there in front of you, you've got to look at it through a different lens or prism. And now you've got to lead, and you've got to determine how, assuming, first you have to answer if, you know, do I want Springfield to be a part of this, or do I not, as the elected leader of the city, in conjunction and in concert with the council? Do I want it or don't I want it? And if I want it, then how do I go about doing it? And I'll just add this final comment. I was so impressed with the city of Springfield and the mayor for setting up a process, and that process pretty much mirrored the process that the Gaming Commission had set up. If you look at the process the Gaming Commission put in place for how they would consider the award of a license and all the things that they would require, the city engaged in very similar, near identical process, and it served them well, and it kept the industry on its toes, because these folks, you know, one thing I learned during all of it, I sat with each and every operator who had any interest in operating anywhere in the state, and I only took meetings in my office. They wanted to meet for coffee. If they wanted to meet in their offices, no. They would meet with me in my office. And the first thing I learned is how well each of those operators knew their competitor's business. They knew it as well as their own, right down to the last penny. And that was fascinating to me. Not surprising as I think about it and reflect back on it. But and the mayor, you know, that was one enormous undertaking.
Huge, absolutely gigantic. If it's maybe okay.
And you folks did a great
please.
job.
Yeah.
All of you did a great job with that.
I think a unique perspective for me was having Joe Lassinger as a partner, Tony Ravosa. We had optioned the Wyckoff and Holyoke. We thought that was the site. We had a feeling from the other players, if that happens, well, that's that, because the site was so good in a gaming sense. But then when Hard Rock finally came to Springfield, the thing that was amazing, I think especially to someone like Joe Lassinger, who is known throughout the industry as someone who would seek sites and do it for other major players. The fellow who actually owns part of a casino with Harris, was the process, not only, here's someone who's been involved in so many states. When we saw the state's legislation, he, as one who would benefit from casino, I remember him saying, this is amazing. They've dotted every I, crossed every T. This is it. This is how it should be done. And he was looking at that from the other side of the table, saying, wow, Massachusetts really got its act together. And then when we came to Springfield, that was the thing that really stunned me. Mayor Sarno, the city council, Kevin Kennedy, who's the head of economic development in the city of Springfield, it was amazing, the meetings with him. He was an equal when he sat on the other side of the table from a Hard Rock or a Penn or an MGM. I don't know where he got all this knowledge of the industry, but it was amazing. And I guess to summate that, right to what Chairman Wagner just said, what stunned us, the Hard Rock team, was how good Springfield was. And I remember there were some consultants brought in from outside, but it was this team, this city team, and it was the mayor directly. He had the criteria that he wanted, but he also made it very clear. Here's what I want from my city. And you got to do this and this and this and this, and this is what the council is going to expect from you. The standard, the bar for Springfield was set so high that, you know, I'll be frank with this, and, you know, I think we were somewhat public on it. Hard Rock did not feel it could meet that bar. We had a monetary amount in mind, and there was a point where we thought, we don't think we can meet the standard of the city of Springfield and the Commonwealth. Who can? MGM. And then there was one other piece of this too, and both you, Mike, and Chairman Wagner have mentioned it, Paul Pignelli. You had somebody who was involved, who was a local partner, who understood this had to be transformational. Where we were going, Hard Rock, I don't think we would have been able to be transformational to the city, to downtown. We secured a letter of intent to buy Tower Square, $44.5 million. That was a feat in itself to be able to secure that from Mass Mutual, Cornerstone, et cetera. And looking at where we are today, and having had kind of dual residency in the city, Pine Point and the South End, I'm looking at these streets, I'm looking at what's happened down here. There's a transformation, and you can start to really see it starting to happen. So the long and the short of it, Hard Rock took a look at the tough bar of Massachusetts and the higher standard of the city of Springfield, and we just said, we don't think we can achieve this. And I remember being very public, kind of handing over the sword, so to speak, to MGM and being very complimentary, saying, they're the one, they can get this done. And then, of course, the final debate on this, or the final competition, was Penn Gaming versus MGM, with two very, very different proposals.
Yeah, so Penn at that time was going to, you know, Penn was going to play to a number. I learned that about Penn, and they were pretty clear on that. Wow. We think we know what the number is. We're gonna go to this number, and we're not going past this number. And they thought their number was going to be higher than the number that others were going to step up with. And I think they got to a point. I don't want to speak for them, and I didn't follow up with them on this, but it was clear at a point that MGM was going to, you know, see their number and raise them until they were out of the game. But to your point about Springfield and the bar, and this is some inside baseball, a little bit of inside baseball. Every operator that came to me that had an interest in Springfield, because of the process that the mayor and working with the council had set up, to an entity, whoever was sitting in front of me or with me said, we're trying to get in to see the mayor and we can't. And they were questioning the process. I said, well, for whatever it's worth, you're not the only operator to say that. So, you know, I would understand why they would want to get in and have access to the mayor, but that process had a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper was Kevin Kennedy.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
And Ed Pakula probably in the law department.
Pakula,
and so that goes to the bar being set high by the mayor. He was going to have the process by which Springfield would consider overtures from casino operators to set up shop in the city of Springfield. He set that bar pretty high, and he said, we are going to have a process, and it's not going to be, you know, you're coming in one door and going out another, and from a little distance. And for the role that I had played in it, that was really impressive to watch play out.
Wow. And I would just build on an earlier point that the representative made, which is a lot of credit is owed to the mayor and his administration for putting this forward. One of the earlier comments you made was you said, you know, the first question is if, and then the next question is how. And the question of if that was really well answered by the mayor was answered in the affirmative. But to get to that answer, we have to look at how the question was framed by the statewide context of what was happening. Because it wasn't the same question that was being asked in the 90s. Does Springfield want casino gaming or not? The likelihood of having it in a competing community was low. There were other discussions. But as we were looking at this after 2012, it wasn't a question of, does Springfield want gaming in Western Mass and do we want it here? The question was, does Springfield want it or do we want to watch it go to Holyoke, to West Springfield, to Chicopee, to Palmer, all these different locations? And so that's a much easier question to answer. And so the mayor and his administration and the city determined pretty early on that we weren't going to sit on the sidelines and watch it go somewhere else. We couldn't afford to watch that vacuum happen with our economic development opportunities in the city. And then when you get to the question of how, the first conversation I remember having about this with the mayor and the city solicitor was, I don't know that we ever anticipated multiple applicants in the same town. And how do we handle the fact that there needs to be a referendum for each host community agreement, and what do we do if more than one is negotiated at the same time? What a mess that would create in terms of voter confusion, in terms of potential litigation. And so, you know, to your earlier point and to the mayor and his team's credit, they bunkered down. And there was a period of silence, and I remember Ed Pakula coming out and saying, we're going to have an RFQ, and then we're going to have an RFP, and after we determine you're qualified, then we're going to see what we can get. And that is really the process that gave us MGM Springfield in the South End and gave us the lucrative proposal that they ended up with. Their first bite at the apple was a $600 million casino. Today we're looking at a $950 million casino. And a lot of that was because of the competitive nature of the way that that process was laid out.
So
Great points, every one of them.
Yeah.
this is why I got you guys here today. So again, I was going through like stories that I had written, and in 2012, Ameristar was the first entity that came aboard to say we want to do this. And what shocked me at that time was their complete and total confidence that they were going to be the only company to come to Springfield and would be the proposal for the city of Springfield. And their confidence extended to the point that they then bought a site well before anything had been settled. Now, I think we owe them a debt of gratitude because they cleaned up the Westinghouse site and made it buildable. And then we have, of course, the Chinese Railcar Company, who was able to build their factory there, providing 150 union jobs and bringing back manufacturing on a large scale to the city of Springfield that will hopefully have many ancillary benefits in the future in terms of our precision manufacturing sector and things like that. So thank you, Ameristar, wherever you are.
Well, they were acquired. I don't recall who acquired them, but they were bought.
But the fact of the matter is,
I loved that site, by the way. I thought that was a great site.
I had a conversation, they had a public meeting at, I can never remember the name of the church, it's the Catholic church there on Page Boulevard.
Mary, Mother of Hope.
Okay, they had a public meeting, and I went up to one of their PR people and I said, now are you aware that there's a proposed biomass plant that's just over here, and they're gonna have like 70 trucks filled with stuff to burn that's gonna go up Page Boulevard every day, right past your casino site? He says, no, I wasn't aware of that. I said, didn't you even Google their city to find out what was happening? And then they went ahead and spent, what was it, like $12–14 million on the Westinghouse site. And it really surprised me that they thought they were going to be the only ones, because then through the door came MGM and Hard Rock and Penn Gaming, and it was really apparent that this was going to be a death struggle between Penn Gaming and MGM about who was going to get the nod and who was going to have the proposal. And the proposals were so radically different, ultimately, because Penn Gaming was talking about, they bragged at one of their meetings about how quickly they could build a casino because they do this. And it was almost like a franchise situation. You know, when McDonald's comes in, they know exactly what they're going to build. And I think Penn Gaming knew exactly what they were going to build. And they had the support of the newspaper, and they had the support of Herbie Flores, and because they were going to use the Paramount. And MGM's proposal was this radically different concept. So, Mike, is this a benefit of our tornado situation that we're talking about? Because honestly, this part of the city was messed up by the tornado. There was issues about what was going to be the ultimate fate of the South End, much less other neighborhoods in the city of Springfield and other communities that were affected in 2011. So do you think that the fact that MGM was looking at an area that really desperately needed a plan helped it?
Well, first, regarding the tornado, obviously it was a terrible natural disaster. It caused wreak and havoc all over the city. Thankfully, we survived it without any fatalities. But it has also created a ton of economic opportunity. Just a few weeks ago, we opened the brand new Pope Francis prep school on Windover Road, the site of the Cathedral High School that was demolished as a result of the tornado. And thanks go out to the congressman for his help with a lot of the FEMA resources, and the mayor and his team for helping us and the cathedral community and getting that school rebuilt. The South End was similarly, havoc was wreaked, and we now have a close to $1 billion casino, retail shops, a variety of amenities and restaurants that are down here and re-energizing this urban core of the city of Springfield and the South End. So certainly opportunities came from that. But I want to go back to your earlier point about Ameristar and them first coming to town and how their concept was so drastically different from everywhere else. The first conversation I had about casino gaming, and this is sort of inside baseball, as the representative said, about casino gaming in Western Massachusetts. I got a call one night from a former hockey coach and mentor of mine for like 15 years when I was younger and growing up, really had a big impact on me. And at this point, I'm on the city council, but I'm also a 23-year-old law student living at my parents' house. And so he says, hey, 14, calls me by my hockey jersey number. We got to get together in the morning. I want to talk with you about something in East Springfield. Can we get together at the McDonald's on Armory Street at the Rotary? I didn't have an office to ask him to come to. And so we met, and he said, how's it going? And this is Paul Stelzer, and so he plays a role with O'Connell Development and Appleton that were the owners of that site on Page Boulevard in East Springfield. And he said, we're being approached by casino operators. What do you think? And I almost choked on my coffee. I'm like, casino operators? Like, is this happening? I was reading about it in the newspaper and what you guys were doing on Beacon Hill, but that had been happening for a long time, and the law still hadn't passed. And so for a period of time, months and months, Ameristar was the casino act in town, and they were going around and lobbying and talking to folks and explaining their proposal. And I think the reason that they thought they were going to be the only act is because they had the only site with 40 acres. They had the only site in the city. Yeah. And they were operating with that same mindset, I believe, that the rest of the electorate was, which is successful casinos in the Northeast look like Foxwoods and Mohegan. They're an entity into themselves. They're isolated. They're in the woods. What we came to find out, and some of it was economic opportunity from the tornado, some of it was the ingenuity and the stick-to-itiveness of the folks that MGM got involved early on, Dennis Murphy, Frank Fitzgerald, a lot of the other key players in the area, to help to put together 10 acres in the South End of commercial real estate. That's a feat that is very difficult to comprehend as a commercial practicing lawyer in the city. It's very difficult to imagine how they could have so quickly put together options on all of those parcels in a way that would make a downtown location like that even possible. And if you look at their footprint, they basically took 4 city blocks with the exception of Bacon Wilson, 55 State Street, Birdstein Law, and Red Rose. They have every other building. They have every other building. And I don't think that even the casino operators like Ameristar at that time thought that that type of feat could be pulled off, but they did it. In Penn, similarly, they had some larger chunks. They had, you know, right next to the Republican and the Paramount, they had larger parcels, which made it a little bit easier for them to put together that strategy. But it just wasn't something that I think Ameristar was comprehending at the time. And so when they first came in, I didn't have a position on gaming. And I certainly didn't have a position on whether gaming should happen in my district in East Springfield on Page Boulevard. There were community meetings. I was at that community meeting at Mary Mother of Hope, and I was hearing from a lot of constituents who were worried. It's a very middle-class, blue-collar, working neighborhood. And they were worried about the impacts as to traffic and changing of the character of the community that they live in and they enjoy. And one thing that I said from the outset is, we don't have the luxury of leading with no. We do not have the luxury of leading with no when it comes to this site. We owe them and we owe ourselves the exploration of this concept and learning more about what this abandoned, contaminated 40-acre site can look like with an infusion of capital from investors that come from very, very far away. At the time, Ameristar, I think, was based in Kansas City, if I remember correctly. And what we found is that without committing to supporting that site, and I never did, we saw them invest. The option that they had with O'Connell that we talked about over coffee at McDonald's turned into a transaction, turned into a sale. And then very shortly after that, they demolished all of the structures except for the original Westinghouse building, which we asked them to preserve for historic purposes, and they cleaned and remediated the entire property. So that also presented a unique economic development opportunity, and we got, fortunately, very shortly after that, CRRC on that site. And so,
and O'Connell was a hidden winner because the site they sold was cleaned up, and then I think they reacquired it before
they may have, yeah.
selling it again.
Yeah.
I think.
If I remember correctly, you're right, sir, that Ameristar sold it back to them when they realized they were done in the city.
And then they sold it to CRRC.
And then we reaped the benefit.
Yeah. So to your question and to the councilor's points, again, which were spot on, you know, Ameristar, I'm going to try and be kind in this remark. They were questioning, at least with me. Well, I think their question to me was, do you think the process is fair in Springfield? I said, I haven't seen anything that suggests that it's anything other than fair. I said, what I've told you, I've told others. You know, the city has a gatekeeper and a process, and it's the same for you as it is for everyone else. So if you're questioning that, show me where it may not be fair, because I haven't seen it. And that's just sort of anecdotal as I offered up. But they love their site because, as you said, 40 acres, highway access north-south, east-west. They just thought it was a great site. I said, my guess would be, for you folks, that you might, given that there are 2 others moving around in the downtown, you might have to consider some connectivity to the downtown. I don't know what that would look like. I don't know whether you're talking about shuttling people back and forth for events, but I think once they saw, you know, the creativity, and frankly, forget the creativity, the industry of acquiring all of those parcels. I think Ameristar looked at it at that point and said, I don't recall at what point they stepped back, but you know, they made a strategic decision to pick the site they did, and they made a strategic decision to step away and say, we're going to, you know, go play somewhere else. And to MGM and the South End, you know, they organized under the name Blue Tarp Development.
Right.
And when you think about that, so to your question, and Councilor, to your comments, I don't think what drove it was to attempt to revitalize the South End. What drove it was that MGM chose the south end and then put forward the best proposal from those that had an interest in Springfield and were willing to put forward proposals. And the two just happened to, fit together really, really, really well.
Tony, I'd just like to ask you this. We're talking about Springfield primarily because we're the winners of this process.
The region, I think, wins on this one.
I agree.
Yeah, I forgot. Sorry, Joe. So at this time that we're having our process in Springfield, there's these multiple processes. So we had the idea of having a Hard Rock casino on the grounds of the Big E, specifically Gate 9 parking area. That's where they were going to put it.
Yeah.
At the same time, it was Mohegan Sun in Palmer, was considering that, and Palmer was going through. Palmer had been one of these communities that had long advocated as a site well before the legislation or during the legislative process. They kept talking about Palmer being the site. They were going through that process. We had the on again, off again in Holyoke, where we had a mayor who said no, and then we had a mayor who said yes, and then he got a lot of resistance from his constituents, and then he said no again. But there was that push me, pull you thing going on in Holyoke. So there was all of these processes that was swirling around in the area. I know at one point Mayor Bissonnette had told me that he had tried to advocate for Cabottville being the site of a casino, which I was trying to wrap my head around envisioning this. I have to.
Tony might be able to speak to that.
Yes.
Okay, so let's. So
That one's news to me.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm glad you said it. Yeah.
So this is what makes good TV, right? Right. Okay.
You're breaking news here today. This is great.
So, I mean, let's talk about for a moment some of these other processes that was going around, because Springfield was doing its thing, but there was a whole galaxy of planets swirling around this issue at the same time. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of these. I mean, you mentioned the interest at Wyckoff Park Country Club in Holyoke, adjacent to Interstate 91, adjacent to an exit for Interstate 91.
There was only going to be one in Western Mass.
Right.
So Springfield had their own process with multiple interested operators, but
at the same time,
other communities had interest from some of those same or other operators.
Right.
And
didn't Steve Wynn come to Holyoke?
There was a time, there was a moment where it was a quick look from Wynn, and then separately Skip Bronson, who I had first met with the Trump organization way back with Peter Picknelly. And it was actually Bronson who, after we divorced with Hard Rock, after Hard Rock looked at Everett, not to make this even more convoluted, we were everywhere. We were in Everett after exiting Springfield. We had looked at Cabottville in Chicopee. The difficulty there was the owner, a fellow from New York, trying to deal with him.
Right.
And then there was the other aspect of it too. Talk about, and I say this in great respect to Chairman Wagner, that was another bar for us, that we would think about going into the community that's represented by the person who's created this legislation, who's put together the rules and whatnot. That was another, that struck us as, okay, wow, that is going to be, here's the man who wrote this legislation. This is in his community, Well,
we had help, and I've just got to say, the Speaker of the House, really, there is not casino gaming in Massachusetts, but for the Speaker's support of it, if I'm being honest. So
true, but outside bar for a second there, though, too. Every time something tough needs to get done in the Massachusetts legislature, think about it. Think about some of the things that Joe's been at the apex of. It's kind of like that Czech cereal commercial back in the day. And I think I was saying this at the Chicopee Chamber about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Remember that commercial, let Mikey try it or give it to him to do it?
Yes.
That's what the legislature's done. And I think that says a lot when the leadership of the legislature says, let's give this tough one to Joe. And you think about some of them, gaming, other issues, etc. But to come back to your question, we were everywhere and looking at everything because we thought for sure we were all set in Holyoke to begin with. And in the industry, Casino Journal, some of the others were starting to report, wow, that looks like the site because of the queuing, to be able to get in and out, be able to have no backup on 91. the uniqueness of the site. And then, good point too, Mike, we had to scramble. There was a point when we were out when it reopened again. And I remember having to call Joe Lassinger and saying, we need a check for X amount to get over to the city of Holyoke to get back into the game and try to go back after the site. And then we were out again. But at the same time, we were in Westfield looking at sites near Barnes Airport.
That's right. Yeah.
Cabottville was really interesting to us, but just not doable given the
I just
owner.
have to ask.
Yeah.
Were you going to knock Cabottville down?
No. Cabottville would become, in the concept,
Yeah.
was to be like Bethlehem Steel, the casino there at the old Bethlehem Steel plant.
Yeah, City to City went there. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I was remembering, I couldn't remember, I think, did you take the trip? Were you
I did
part
not,
of that?
no, but I was briefed on
Yeah,
it both
I mean, there's
before and after.
so much to this. I mean, you could write volumes on it because I couldn't remember who had gone down, but the buildings were almost identical when you looked at them. This old 1840s or 60s cotton mill initially, they almost looked the same, and that was going to be the concept. That's what we had thought.
Wow.
So we're looking at that at the same time that we're running around in Westfield on land next to Barnes. We were looking at other sites as well, and even out to Everett to take a look at where the Wynn organization is now. Hard Rock wanted in, and it was just so difficult to try to figure this piece out. And while we're looking and doing that, MGM is doubling down in Springfield. And it was a project that kept evolving. I really liked everything that Mike has reminded us about that MGM did in the beginning. But one other key thing, I remember sitting with Hard Rock and saying, we've got to go out into the unique neighborhoods of the city of Springfield. So 16 years in the Pine Point Citizens Council myself, we knew you had to deal with the neighborhood councils, as even Ameristar was dealing with in East Springfield, Pine Point, et cetera. We never got to that point. And MGM was in every one of those neighborhoods before we even got in gear, when we came back and doubled down on Springfield ourselves. And to their credit, they were going to neighborhood councils, they were sitting down talking to average, regular folks, residents, small businesses, and they were making the case, even before there was a referendum. Here's what MGM means to 16 acres, to the north end, to Indian Orchard. I was amazed by that. I mean, it was a grassroots ground campaign, and well done. And both the chairman and the councilor are sharp on another piece of this too, the blue tarp piece that was mentioned. Kudos and credits to everyone that was involved in that, but even there too, you know, if I'm not speaking too insider, as we were watching, we watched Paul Pignelli himself. I mean, it was like he went door to door.
Right.
And he utilized who he knew, what he knew of the community, and it just was like his dad had come back, so to speak, who had these relationships and who knew. And they weren't talking just about, here's what this gaming entity is going to be and the glitz of this and then the sizzle and the shine. It was, here's what this means for Springfield. Here's what this will mean for the South End. You know, to get the support of the South End Citizens Council, the Community Council. My family has gone to the same church in the South End since I think the 1930s. You walk out the front door of Mount Carmel, I'm looking at transformation. You know, I'm not seeing the neighborhood that we did, you know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And there's no nostalgia for a lot of us that are so, you know, tied to the South End. This is pretty cool. This is pretty amazing what's happened. How did that get done? Street knowledge, grassroots, someone like a Paul Pignelli being able to say, here's what's going to be important. And frankly, that's the other thing we saw with MGM. We couldn't move as fast as they were on this one project. They kept evolving. They kept adding different components because of what they were hearing from city councilors, from legislators, from, you know, being in tune with neighborhood activists, hearing back from folks who matter on the street. They kept evolving. They kept making it a better project.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would add to that is that really what was the haymaker for MGM that, from my perspective, knocked the other competitors, both in Springfield and elsewhere, out of the game, was their ability to demonstrate synergies in the downtown. All of these projects were significant investments. All these projects were going to create thousands of jobs, and all of these projects were going to bring in tourism, no matter which location and which town you were talking about. MGM was the only one that was talking about breathing life into an existing convention center, breathing life into an existing symphony hall, and breathing life into an existing city stage. You combine that with taking a huge swath of underdeveloped, poorly maintained real estate in the south end of Springfield that desperately needed help with the tornado. You add in the loop PVTA trolley system, You add in all of the other components and the market rate housing that we're still working on with them. All of those things were just not a part of the other casino proposals, and it was really fleshed out as a result of the mayor's RFQ and RFP process. So they didn't have the locations and the infrastructure to make those kinds of pitches.
Yeah, when you look at it in the context of one license potentially, if the Gaming Commission decided to award a license in this region, and the look all over the region, Springfield is not only competing for the license for Springfield, but the operator is competing, you know, they had to partner even as they were negotiating a tough deal. And there was a lot at stake for everyone. It was important that MGM make accommodations if they wanted to get the city's nod, and it was important for the city to get to a deal, and a good deal for the city with MGM, in order that they could say to the Gaming Commission, in the event that there were multiple people in Western Mass staking claim, it should be us. And all of it sort of coalesced, you know, in a way that was really good, I think, for the downtown, for the city. And, you know, people talk about the gaming law, but if you look at the local process and the way in which that partnership came together, it was fascinating.
If I can break format for a minute and ask a question of
Sure.
the people that have more experience in this. This has always been a question for me in my mind, and maybe you can speak to the legislative intent here, Representative, and Tony, maybe you as well, from some of the more historical components. What we ended up with in Western Mass was a competitive process in the city of Springfield and sort of against the other communities and the other community proposals. That process left us with MGM being the last man standing.
Yep.
Palmer voted it down, West Springfield voted it down, Holyoke's mayor said no, and the other Springfield proposals were eliminated through the mayor's process. And I just wonder, was that a part of your analysis or thinking when this law was created, or did you think that it would be the MGC ultimately that was picking between the different operators? I think it worked out wonderfully.
Yeah.
But I wonder what you thought coming in.
So when we established the Mass Gaming Commission, we wanted to keep it at arm's length from any political body or entity. I mean, we have the AG's office involved statutorily, and the Mass State Police, Executive Office of Public Safety. We created a division within the Attorney General's office that you know, involving the state police. But we gave over the implementation of the law to the Gaming Commission. They established the process by which communities played. So, you know, as everybody knows, statutorily we provide a broad outline, and then they fill in, consistent with that outline, the details. And that's what the Gaming Commission did. I think what the city did, to their credit, was they looked at the process that the Gaming Commission had established, and they said, something like that would serve us well. And that's how they got there. The legislation directed the Gaming Commission to give broad authority to local governments and communities in determining what they wanted or what they did not want. The legislation required that the question be put to the people, and not just the question, as you referenced earlier, do you want it or don't you want it? The deal, the host city agreement that the city and operator had agreed to was what was before the voters. So the voters could, if they wanted to, could read the deal in its entirety.
The biggest ballot I've ever seen.
So people had the opportunity to know what they were voting on and voting for or voting against. And so I don't know whether that gets to your question as well as you would like, but we established a gaming commission. We told them what we wanted. They filled in the details. They held communities to a pretty high standard, and they made sure that communities approached the process locally, consistent with the law that the legislature had passed. And central to our considerations at the legislative level was local control. If this was going to be, we did not want to impose our view of what casinos should look like on cities and towns, but we did direct that the Gaming Commission, they needed to be transformative. They needed to be game changers So we didn't just want dollars on the back end of it. We wanted things that would change the face of communities in a good way if we were going to do this, a best practices kind of thing. How does this entity, a new industry the Commonwealth is bringing online, how does it fit with the fabric and culture of a city and a region? And that involved partnerships all around, the legislature, the Gaming Commission, the city, potential operators. So it wasn't a short answer, but it may not even have been a clear answer, but that's my answer.
Well, I think it was a good answer.
Yeah, it was a good answer.
Personally, I could do another hour of this because I find all of this fascinating. However, my producer is lurking here in the background telling me that we've already done an hour.
Wow.
So
really?
amazingly, huh?
Holy smokes.
So I want to thank you three gentlemen for providing so much insight. I tend to be a bit of a policy wonk. I love economic development stories. This story to me is an amazing story. How we wound up with basically an experimental format casino that's designed for people to have it integrated into a community. I'm happy to note that the former United Bank building is now a gift shop. There's some other stores moving in, so we're starting to see in Springfield what never happened in Atlantic City, which is the economic development cross the street, which never happened there. Now we're starting to see it, and this is the whole idea that was behind this, to have this be an economic development engine that would have an impact outside of its footprint.
May I say, I know we're over. Can I say one thing to that, though, and to the audience watching? I have said to people, I've said it to the mayor, I've said it to local economic development officials, Chamber of Commerce officials, I've said it to MGM, I've said it to my colleagues representing Springfield. If this is only the casino, okay, then it's not an opportunity fulfilled. That this casino should serve as a foundation around which other good things happen in the city of Springfield and in this region.
That's right.
And that really should be the goal. The casino can be the impetus for that, but it's going to require directed efforts and partnerships. So, you know, the casino may be central to it, but more good things can happen as a result of it, and that's going to require due diligence on the part of everybody here and everybody out there.
Thank you again, gentlemen, for taking the time. Maybe we can do this again. We can go to Chapter 2 and talk about things like when MGM decided to eliminate the 26-floor tower, which I know for Councilor Fenton was
Worked out pretty well next door.
No,
It
that's
still
right.
looks
That's
pretty
true.
good.
Their mistake there was in saying they had to have it, and then saying they didn't have to have it. It's a better project without it.
I agree myself, but thanks very much, folks, for watching this issue of Government Matters, and please tune in again here to Focus Springfield.